No, I don't think they are.
They're not. Okay.
No.
So let's. I guess we can dive into that next. This is fucking hilarious. So let's dive into the idea of gender itself. Okay.
Okay.
How many would you say there are? An infinite number?
I don't know, man. I don't know. I have no clue.
You have no clue how many there are?
No. How many
Okay.
names are there in the world, Andrew?
Do you consider every name a gender?
No, but I think they're a relevant category of identification. So, yeah.
Well, okay.
They're the same relevant category of identification.
Do you understand like a label versus a descriptor?
Sure, but I think
Okay,
I think there's a lot of overlap between the two.
No, there's not really a lot of overlap between the
there
two.
is.
An empty label is my name is Andrew. Do you agree with me? My name is Andrew.
Sure.
Okay. Do you agree with me that there could be many Andrews sitting at the table with me right now?
Sure.
So Andrew doesn't describe anything about me. It's a label, right?
There are certain connotations with it. For example, I would assume that you're a man. I would assume that that's largely an American
Andrew
name.
doesn't determine that.
But it's associated with it.
No, it's not even associated with it. So let's take
are you
something
saying
like
there's not more?
Andy. Take something like Andy then.
Yeah, then we wouldn't know.
Okay, so it's just an empty label, right?
Empty is weird. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's just an empty label. So, but if I were to say man or male, that is a descriptor which is trying to point at something specific. It's not an empty label, yeah?
Yeah.
So what is a man and what is a woman? Start with what a woman is.
Sure. So I think largely, and I claim this was my debate with Jim Bob, and I'll claim it with you. I'm not super well versed in like gender ideology or things of that nature. So I don't have comprehensive definitions or sets of necessary and sufficient conditions that must be met in order for someone to be in one category. So if we're talking about, for example, woman and man, there are biological definitions of this thing. If you look in the dictionary, this is the reason why there's multiple definitions.
So what's
for
a woman,
words.
dude?
Okay, so I think a biological definition could be something like an adult human female.
Okay.
But I do think there can be social definitions of woman, of someone who has a desire to be in accordance with a particular set of social and cultural norms that are typically associated with the female sex.
Okay, so if a person did not have those norms but identified themselves as a woman, would you call them that?
So what did I just say
Answer
before?
my question.
No, but what did I say
You-
before?
you
You're
said-
asking a question that shows that you didn't listen to what I said before.
Okay. In fact, I'll steelman it just to
Okay.
make sure that I
No.
got it correct. You think that there are scientific definitions which we can associate to male and female. You gave
Correct.
an example. The example for female was adult human, or I'm sorry, for woman, adult human female from the scientific end. You agree with that portion so far?
Yeah, but that's,
okay.
you
then-
did miss something
hang
at the
on.
beginning.
Then
but
when
okay.
we go into gender, you say what gender is it's a series of traits and cultural and social, like social norms in which we would attribute to somebody, which would then make them either woman or man.
So first, you missed the first part that I said,
Okay.
which I said that I don't think there is a comprehensive set of necessary and sufficient conditions that can be given for man or woman. There's going to be things that lie outside of there, and it's really
Actually,
hard
that's
to
perfect.
define.
Can we stop
Really
that?
hard to
Can we
define.
stop right there?
Okay.
Since you're confused as to how many necessary conditions there would be, then it would be just a descriptor or a self ID, right?
No, not necessarily.
Then what else would it be?
I think. I'm not sure. I think.
You're not sure?
No, but Andrew,
You're not sure, bro? What else would it be besides a self ID then?
Self ID. Other people recognizing it. If people don't
But
recognize
other people
you,
are
it's
recognizing
fine.
it based on the scientific definition.
Some people aren't.
They
Some
conflate
people,
it with the scientific
some
definition.
people are also with social, though.
Yeah,
Some people definitely do. Do you
would
know someone's
call a person-
chromosomes
Great.
when they walk
Would you
down the
call
street?
Brian, if Brian looked exactly like he looks right this second, but said that he's a woman, right?
And you wanted to use she, her pronouns? I don't really give a shit.
Yeah, you would agree that he is then. Yeah. Right?
Sure.
Okay, so then a woman would have to be anybody who identifies as a woman.
Well, no, because that would be a circular definition.
Yeah,
And I'm
so
not-
then tell me what it is then. If
So
you agree
I
that
don't
Brian
think-
can be a woman right
I
now
don't-
by
I don't-
saying he
I don't-
is,
I think he can be a woman in the social sense of it, but I don't think he can be a woman
how
in
can
the
he
sense
be a
of the
woman in the
biological.
social sense of it?
Because there's not a set of necessary and sufficient conditions.
Then it
that
would just
can
be
given.
self-ID.
Just because there is ambiguity around boundaries doesn't mean the categories don't exist.
Oh, no,
So I
hang
think-
on, I agree, unless we have a category to point to, which we do. So we have a category, man, woman, which
Sure.
points to male, female.
Okay.
Right? So those categories do exist. When we're talking about ambiguity here, you're creating the ambiguity by just failing to admit that you just believe it's a self-ID.
I don't necessarily think it is a
Then
self-ID.
tell me what it is.
I think it's a combination of someone identifying as and them being recognized by other people in the society. So if Brian said he was a woman right now, full honesty right now, I don't really think I would think he was a woman.
You would think he was.
No, I wouldn't think he was.
You
a woman,
wouldn't think he was.
because I think most people wouldn't recognize him as such. And I do think that if most people in a
Okay.
society don't recognize someone as a woman, even if they identify as a woman, then for a lot of functional purposes, they aren't treated as a woman, and they aren't. So even if their self-ID is that way, it's not going to match up to the treatment that they're going to have.
I see. So you wouldn't believe Brian if he said he was a woman?
Right now, no, probably not.
Probably not.
I might use she/her pronouns if Brian wanted to use that information.
Would you treat Brian like a woman?
I don't think there is a proper way to treat a man or treat a woman. So I would treat Brian like a human being the same way I
Okay.
would treat men and treat women.
Okay. So, but you would use his pronouns.
Sure.
Okay. And you would use those pronouns as a matter of respect that
Yeah.
he said he's a woman.
Well, yeah, I just don't want to be an asshole. Like I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
That's just being a jerk.
I think intentionally misgendering someone, like I don't. I just because it's kind
Yeah,
of. It's kind
I'm
of a
really
jerk move.
just not really kind of satisfied here. I'm sorry. I want to be so that we can move into the proper gender roles for society. But if we can't really nail down what a woman is, I'm not sure how we're supposed to nail down how men and women are supposed to function with each other in intersexual dynamics, or how they're supposed to interact with each other in social dynamics. I'm not really sure that we can even get to that part unless we nail down what even a man and a woman is.
So I mean, we've nailed it down largely biologically, but I think
No, we haven't.
but I
Well,
think-
we haven't nailed down what your definition of these things
So
are.
I don't see. Here's the thing: is you're going to rigidly categorize men and women into male and female, and then say that certain gender roles follow from that.
They do.
I'm basically saying that I don't think those gender
Yeah,
roles
that's
follow
great, but you won't nail
because-
down what a man and a woman even is.
because I don't think you can give a comprehensive.
Well,
set
then
of
how
gender-
can you make social prescriptions for what they ought or ought not
Andrew,
do?
what's a chair?
So
What's a
this
chair?
is interesting, right?
What is a chair?
A chair, just like sports team, you could use that same analogy. This is
just
one
chair.
of the it's the same thing. I'm explaining it, right? And I'll answer the question. I'll give you the descriptor of what a chair is.
Okay.
Right. My proprietary definition of a chair is that it's a thing you sit on that has like 4 standing legs and a cushion and things like this, right?
They have a beanbag chair.
But but here's what's interesting, right, about this. I'm trying to point to something.
Correct.
Just like with sports teams. If I say there's a sports team, right, or a sports fan, sorry,
Yes.
sports fan, you could say, what is a sports fan, right? Is it just an empty label? Nah, it's really not. You would assume that there's things that come with it. Like,
Yeah, and I don't think
hang
they're
on,
empty labels.
Hang on. Like, you would assume for a second that they support the team, they support this, they support that, right? When I give a definition of a chair, while it is true that there can be a very comprehensive, descriptive definition of a chair, I'm actually not wrong about my definition of chair. And
Sure.
you're not wrong about your definition of chair either when you say beanbag chair, right?
I'm also not
Because
wrong
we're still trying to point to the same idea of what a chair is. In this case, we're not pointing to the same idea of what a woman or a man is.
Sure, I don't necessarily think so. And I think that the social definition, there are a lot of people who ascribe to that. And when people think of woman and think of man, they do think of traditional woman and traditional
They
man.
think of pussies and dicks, dude.
I don't necessarily think so, dude.
Yeah, I think when you would make an association of man versus woman, right? Well, if somebody's asked a person, what is the thing that you would think of if a person was naked that would identify them immediately as a man or a woman?
right.
What do you think they would say?
Naked is different because
What
I
do you
don't-
think they would say?
Sure, Andrew.
What would they say?
If their genitals are out, they're going to point out their genitals.
Yeah,
Andrew.
yeah, because-
Are most
because- and
people's-
why do you
are
think
most
they're gonna
people's
point out
genitals
their genitals?
Are most people's genitals out a long time?
Bro, what does that have to do with anything?
Because if someone were to ask me, what do I associate with womanhood, I would say a lot of things that are associated with femininity. Longer hair, wearing certain type of clothing, things of that
Fashion?
nature.
Fashion?
To me, that's...
Fashion?
Wait, in
Longer
a sense,
hair?
Hold on. In a sense, I'm not saying that that's a comprehensive definition of
Because-
woman.
because-
I'm
well, it doesn't
saying
even point to
hold
it,
on,
the same
I'm
thing.
saying for me,
Yeah.
those are things that I value and find attractive in women.
Okay, when I'm saying woman or man, I'm giving a descriptor which is trying to point to something.
Yes.
Right? Point to it. You're trying to say that there's 2 categories. That man and woman is not just a biological categorization,
Yes.
but there's a social categorization.
And they do adhere to
but
largely
when you
their
say that
social
it's
roles.
not a comprehensive social categorization,
Yes.
right? What else could it be besides self-ID? What else could it be?
I don't think it has to be one or the other, Andrew. There is ambiguity in definitions. Like, if someone says I'm a woman and like if people say they're not, like what?
Well, first of all, there's not ambiguity in all definitions.
Then,
but
then we're butting heads.
But secondly, definitions also operate. They have defining ends. They have defining ends. What is the defining end? What are the things which are the undercurrent of the definition that they're pointing to? They're saying like a chair, right? You might have like little things under the definition of a chair that point to things you sit on, right? Things that you relax on, things like this.
Yes.
That's what's doing all the heavy lifting for the word.
Yes.
What's doing all the heavy lifting for the word man and woman? What is it?
I think it can be and is social roles.
No, it's sex. It's 100% sex doing the heavy lifting for man and woman, dude. Give me a break.
I don't necessarily
think so. Demonstrated. All of the definitions, all of the things which support the definitions of man and woman, all of them are pointing to sex. Literally all of them.
Okay.
Like basically every one of them.
Sure.
If you think reproduction, right? If
what
even
point
woman,
follows
even
from
with
this?
when it comes to woman, right?
Okay.
Adult human female. If you look up the definition of female, especially human female, it says like one a member of the human race which is associated with reproduction, right?
Okay.
It's literally utilizing the reproductive categorization of genitalia. Right?
Well, there's genitalia. I mean, there's a difference between the reproductive...
Oh, how do they get pregnant, bro?
Difference between the reproductive system
how do
and genitalia.
how do they get pregnant?
I'm not saying it doesn't involve genitalia.
Of course it does. All of it is being held up by sex. All of it, dude.
Okay. If someone doesn't have the internal reproductive organs but has a vagina, do you think they're a woman?
Of course. And I can even dive into that too. So the monolithic argument for gender is my favorite one. I wouldn't say that a man who was castrated, right, through no fault of his own, he was in a terrific accident and the genitals were ripped off. Of course, he's still a man, but here's why. Because people only develop around two pathways. That's it. There's no third sex. There's never going to be a third sex. Nobody alive has ever been able to impregnate themselves, not even chimeras. Sure. Because of that, there's only two reproductive pathways available, period. You're still a woman. Even if you don't have a uterus, your reproductive pathway was still developed to that of a woman, to that of a female.
But it didn't develop.
It did develop.
Well, a lot of these people who have this condition, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, are those who have XY chromosomes and develop along a male pathway.
No, they develop that. Even if you have XXY, right? Or there are actually men who just have XX, but their reproductive pathway can only be one of two. They can only develop along two reproductive pathways, period, regardless of chromosomes. And that's every human being who exists. Even ones who have the nature of their, the nature of them is ambiguous, right? The ambiguity around genitalia and things like this are ambiguous. They still can only go down one phenotypical pathway, period.
Okay.
And genotypical. So if sex is doing all of the heavy lifting, I think that it is fine for us to point at man and woman and say a man, right, is someone who developed along the reproductive pathway for the production of small gametes, and woman for ova.
Sure.
It doesn't require they have a uterus.
Yeah.
They still develop down that pathway,
sure.
right?
And that absolutely is a biological definition. But we use those words in other ways, right?
No, we don't.
We don't. When we say well, then how come we can say a woman is manly and the sentence makes sense? Because we're
pointing to masculine or feminine virtues.
Agreed. So
virtues.
But we use those terms to refer to social phenomena, right?
Well, no,
manly,
not always.
And
actually, most of the time, right, when you're doing that, there is times when this is done. I agree with you, where you're like, oh, that chick is, or you're nagging me like a woman.
Yeah.
Right.
How many people in the comments right now do you think are calling me a woman?
But the whole point of that, right, is to say that like you're weaker than me or this or that. You're still actually associating this with the sex. You're still associating it with the fact that that's the weaker sex or that's the more dominant sex. Basically, all of those social interactions still revolve around that same idea.
Sure, I haven't denied that.
Yeah, I mean, so they're always pointing, in other words, all extremes for gender are always actually only pointing to two things, male, female. That's it. So if that's the case, when we're talking about social roles in society, men and women, male, female, are completely different. I mean, totally different across the board. We're humans, true, right? But everything from our developmental pathway for reproduction, right, to our physical characteristics are completely different. Why in the world would you prescribe a society which didn't bank on the ideas of that and understand that if we are to push the very things which combine our physiology with the social status of people creates a better society. For instance, would you prescribe, like if we're talking about the military, would you prescribe that we had more women in the military than men?
More women than men in the military? Largely probably not, because they don't meet the same standards. And
Of course not.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah, of course. So then a failing of courage of men, considering that they have to take on that role, that dominant,
men.
hang on, that dominant, but they have to, right?
Not.
No, they always have to.
No man is obligated to join the military. Therefore, it's not.
Yeah, they
an
are. They can be
obligation.
drafted.
Okay, I don't agree with the draft.
It doesn't matter if you agree
okay.
with it or not. They can descriptively be drafted and women
Okay,
can't.
and that's unjust.
That's unjust.
Yes.
Okay, so
There shouldn't be a draft.
so what about police officers, police force? You can be deputized.
Yeah, I think that's no. You shouldn't
That's
be able to do
unjust
that.
too.
Yep.
You can be compelled into a posse. That's unjust.
Define. Sorry.
Compelled into a posse, just like you can be compelled into jury duty, right?
Sure, jury duty. I think it's a little bit different because you're not putting yourself in as much harm's way. I don't think that anyone should be conscripted into being a police officer or being that. Because of course there are
there's
certain,
but there's always dangers. There's always dangers associated with all of this, including jury duty, right?
And there's going to be a threshold, right? Okay.
Which is what?
We don't know exact. Of course, I don't have to point. Wait, I don't have to point to an exact point to say that there is a difference between sitting on a jury duty and having a gun on you and potentially people shooting at you.
You do if you say that the consistency of the ideology is that you don't believe in this thing because it can put you in harm's way. But this thing also puts you in harm's way.
Significant harm. What do you?
Okay, so
fine. Okay. Yeah. Of course. I'm not arguing there's not a threshold, Andrew.
But not just that.
I'm not arguing there's not a threshold.
Let's start with the Titanic. So should the men have given up the lifeboats to the women?
Men giving up the lifeboats to the women?
And the children?
If they were largely